In this discussion, we will be finishing up our HTML foundations and conversation and moving forward to discussing a little bit more in depth about CSS. All right, so additional HTML I just want to discuss with you guys. And again, we will do these hands-on demos in class. Again, thinking about structure. So when we talk about HTML, we will have a doc type. Each web page should begin with a doc type declaration to tell a browser which version of the HTML the page is using. So whether it's HTML6 or whatever the newest version is. If you're using anything that's helping you write the code, when you create an HTML document, it will automatically fill this in for you. But that just tells the browser what specific HTML language to read and to use. So block elements, we talked, when we think about HTML, that's going to be a block element. Like when we are typing it, everything is going to be mostly, unless we tell otherwise, it's going to be left aligned. Everything is going to be on its individual line, and visually it kind of looks like these rectangles. So block level elements are elements that always appear to start on a new line in the browser window. So block level elements, for example, are your headers, paragraphs, unordered lists, and a list item. Okay, that is a block level element. Everything starts on its own line, and essentially, if you were to trace around it, it would create these blocks. Inline elements. So inline elements are, if you think about time to a single revolution of the planet around the sun, degrees that tilt out, blah, blah, blah. So if we're looking at, this is our code, by the way, this is not anything specific that you need to memorize. But if we take a look at, thought I would just narrate to you a little bit there. So don't really think about what the words say, just look at where the tags are. So we have an M here, an M here. So that means that we're putting emphasis on something. And then we're going to bold this line, and then we're going to bold, right? So inline elements, things like bold, emphasis, image elements, to name a few. Inline elements are elements that always appear to continue on the same line as their neighboring elements. So if we're looking at, this is what we're typing in our code, and we have our tags here and our tags here. If you take a look at this, these always appear in line. So for example, this is our sentence. This is where we start our emphasis tag. This is where we end our emphasis tag. And then our bold elements could be here. So inline always appear to be on the same line of your neighboring elements. So block level appear on a line by themselves. Inline appear to continue on the same line. Okay, so just getting used to, again, that structure, understanding that structure and the formatting of the HTML. So thinking about grouping elements. When we group elements, we will group them in a block, and we will use what is called the div element. Okay, the div element allows you to group a set of elements together in one block level box. So everything as far as HTML and CSS concerned, we're thinking about it in chunks and in blocks, right? These little block area things. So uses for the div element. You might create a div element to contain all the elements for the header of your site. Div elements will always start on a new line. And div allows you to create CSS rules tied to certain div elements. So rather than having to set a CSS rule for every little element on your page, if you bundle your HTML in div blocks, you can modify a div block in your CSS. So this div block, maybe for example, this div block is your header, and your header appears on every page of your website. If you style that div block once, it's going to look like that on every page. So not only does it save time, but it also helps you stay consistent in the stylizing of your pages. All right, so a div example. So we would start a div tag. A div will most always have an ID. So for example, if we're calling this header, We have our image source, so maybe we have our logo in our header for our website, and then we will have an unordered list. So our navigation links are actually a list. So each list item becomes a link. So there we've got our href. So that is like our home page, our biography page, our works page, and then we end the div tag. So all of this is contained in a div, which we have identified as a header. So if we are modifying our header, whatever we're modifying to that, if that header is on one page or if it's on 10 pages, it's always going to look the same, okay? Grouping text and elements inline, thinking of our span element. The span element acts like an inline equivalent of the div element. So uses for the span, to contain a section of text where there's no other suitable element to differentiate it from its surrounding text, to contain a number of inline elements, and to use to assign a class or ID for CSS attributes. So again, this is what a span would look like. This is our paragraph. We have span class gallery, span gallery in London. So still inline, works similar to our div, but specific to inline elements. All right, so that was wrapping up our HTML and talking a little bit more about structure. Again, we'll do some more demos on that in class so you can better understand that. But let's go ahead and jump in to our CSS introduction. So thinking inside the box. Again, everything's very boxy when we talk about HTML and CSS. So we have, if this is our basic web page, I want you to think about envisioning that there is an invisible box around everything. So if we have a header, there's a box around that. For a paragraph, there's a box around that. Even the actual body of our web page is contained in a box, okay? So the key to understanding how CSS works is to imagine that there's an invisible box around every HTML element. So what's going on with that box? Let's unpack that a little bit more. So CSS functions off of what is called the box model, which we'll discuss a little bit further in these lessons, but I wanted to get you into thinking about what is a CSS rule. We mentioned that briefly in our previous video, so take a look at the breaking down of this. So again, this whole P font family, blah, 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 this whole thing is what is called a rule. And the CSS rule, that's your standard writing for CSS. You will always write things with your CSS rules. But let's break that rule down, okay? So if we're looking at the pink area here, so we would be, for this we would be modifying a paragraph. We have our selector. So that is our first part of our CSS rule. And the selector, this indicates which element the rule applies to. Okay, so this is saying, hey, whatever this says here, I want you to do it to this guy. Okay, font family, Arial. So we don't want to get too honed in on what this particular thing is doing. I just want you to understand the function of a rule. But this, so we have our selector, and then the second part of the rule is our declaration. Okay, this indicates how the elements referred to should be styled. So just for an example, we are modifying our paragraphs in our HTML, and we are changing the font family. So this is universally anything that is a paragraph on one page or 10 pages will look like this. Okay, this is how it would appear. The font family will always be Arial for any and all of our paragraphs. All right, so breaking that down a little bit more. So we talked about our CSS rule. We talked about the selector and the declaration. So again, selector, declaration. And within the declaration, we have one more level, okay? We have what is called a property and a value. So this whole thing, okay, this whole thing here is our declaration. The yellow here, the property, that says what you want to change, and then The second part is known as the value, and that is the settings that you want, okay? So within our declaration, so this full piece here is our declaration, but within the declaration, we are changing the property and we are changing the value, okay? So if we jump down here, so for example, we are still doing a paragraph, but we want to change the color, and the value of that color is yellow, okay? I do want to point out, and we'll experiment with this in class, I do want to point out you can have multiple declarations in one CSS rule. So here with this paragraph, we're not only modifying the font family, but we're modifying the color of the text as well, okay? So if we break that down, we have the CSS rule, which is this whole thing, okay? And then we have the selector, and then we have the declaration, and then we have within the declaration property and a value, okay? So again, demo, we'll do that demo in class. And that is our first little quick intro to CSS and finishing up some of our HTML conversations. The next couple of videos will go into a little bit more specifics about CSS rules.